As an administrator, Dr. Pretty emphasized thrift in all things. He took satisfaction, he wrote in one report of the superintendent, quote, end quote, whenever he visited institutions in another state and compared the condition of their inmates from the standpoint of health, comfort, and death rate, and their cost of maintenance. He inadvertently found, he said, that Virginia was supporting its inmates with practically as much comfort and as much cost to the taxpayers than in most any other state. Dr. Pretty had many ways of keeping expenses in check, which he enumerated in his public reports. His economicizing touched on every aspect of the inmates' lives and continued even after they died. Dr. Pretty found that funeral costs could be kept at a minimum if inmates were buried on the colony's grounds. If relatives insisted on holding their own services, they were required to pay the embalming and shipping costs. The colony soon expanded its mission. After initially admitting only epileptic men, in 1912, it began to accept the feeble-minded and women inmates, both epileptic and feeble-minded. The new admission policies helped to take some of the pressure off of the other state hospitals, which were filled beyond capacity. A few years earlier, the commissioner of the state hospitals had warned in a report that if additional accommodations were not made available for housing the mentally defective and epileptics, some of them would have to be held in jails. The colony began to fill up with inmates who had been abjugated as feeble-minded, many of them poor women who had run afoul of the police or government agencies. Dr. Pretty took a dim view of many of his female charges. In a 1914 annual report, he described one group as unfortunate creatures who were, quote, adept in the use of the vilest language and practices common among women of their class, end quote. The women, quote, morons at the colony, Dr. Pretty would later say, quote, consisted for the most part of these who would formerly have found their way into the red light district and became dangers to society. The colony continued to expand. Several new buildings opened in rapid succession. The Maston Minor Building, which housed feeble-minded women, the Strode Massey Building, home to 100 epileptic women, the Lesnar Fletcher Hall, which had an auditorium on the first floor and classrooms below. Another residence, Lee Cato Cottage, added 56 more inmate beds. It was no longer accurate to refer to the colony as simply a facility for epileptics. In recognizing of its wider mission, on October 1st, 1919, the name was officially changed to the State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. Over the next few years, an increasing percentage of the new admissions were feeble-minded. By 1925, more than two-thirds of the colony's inmates would be classified as mentally retarded. Dr. Pretty carefully managed inmate population. He insisted on housing feeble-minded and epileptic inmates separately, and he drew the line at accepting idiots, the lowest grade of Goddard's hierarchy. Quote, pitiful appeals in behalf of the admission of idiots continue to be received, end quote. Dr. Pretty lamented in a 1923 report, but, quote, all such applications have to be rejected, end quote. Dr. Pretty came to the colony at a time when opinions were changing about what to do with the feeble-minded. In the early days of the Republic, there was little help available for people with mental difficulties. Unlike Virginia, with its public hospital for persons of insane and disordered mind, most states left it to local communities to care for people with mental disabilities who, quote, commonly languished in local jails and poorhouses or lived with family and friends. As a nation's population increased and became more urban, these formal approaches became outdated. States began to establish public mental hospitals. Massachusetts in 1848, New York in 1851, Pennsylvania in 1853, and Connecticut in 1855. This, quote, cult of asylum continued to spread, and by the start of the Civil War, almost every state had one or more facility for the mentally ill. It was a sign that the institutionalization movement had reached critical mass when, in 1877, administrators organized the Association of Medical Officers of American Institution for Idiot and Feeble-Minded Persons. These institutions for the mentally defective began idealistically with a commitment to, quote, moral treatment and compassionate care, and a conviction that they could do great deal to help their patients. In time, however, this therapeutic impulse began to give way. During the Gilded Age, the final 3 decades of 1800s, it was increasingly replaced by the darker assessment of power with mental defects, and where they fit in the social and biological order. For nearly a century, social scientists had been reframing from the history and future of humanity in biological terms. In 1798, the English political economist Thomas Malthus published an essay on the principle of population, in which he offered a bleak vision of the implication of population growth. Malthus argued that the world's population would eventually outstrip the food supply, with only famine and disease to provide a counterbalance. The power of, quote, the power of population is so superior to the power in the earth to produce sustain for men that, unless arrested by the preventive check, premature death must be in some shape or other visit the human race, Malthus warned. A half-century later, in 1851, the English philosopher Herbert Spencer argued in Social Statics that rather than being guided by God, humans were evolving based on scientific rules. In the book and several later ones, Spencer identified a natural sorting process that separated those who were strong enough to survive and those who were not. In his 1864 work, The Principles of Biology, he gave this process a name, survival of the fittest.